Out of all of Hollyland's wireless video transmission systems I've tried, this is the only one I can actually recommend anybody buy, the Hollyland Cosmo C2. It's honestly pretty great. I've tried a handful of systems from Hollyland before, and they always run into the same problems. They are inexpensive, usually about $500 for a set, but the latency is usually too high to actually match up for live broadcast. The quality just isn't there. You get a lot of blocking, and honestly, the range is just never really what I need it to be. However, with this guy, all of those problems kind of go away. And the price is actually still reasonable, and it even packs a few more features that are pretty exciting to me. So let's just take a look at it, and I'll tell you why I love it for my church and who it may or may not be good for. And in case you need some more convincing, I actually think I am replacing our wireless systems with this permanently. So first off, the actual hardware, right? So this system right here with the transmitter and receiver is $1,000. Or you can buy the package that has 2 transmitters, and that's $1,300. But you still only need the single receiver. That's right, this actually has 2 different outputs on it, so it can connect to 2 receivers at the same time and still send your 2 different signals where they need to go. That is my first favorite feature about this guy. It's a little bit more compact because you only need the single receiver, even if you're running 2 different cameras with it. That's even more compact than it sounds like, because generally when you have more than one receiver, you need to place them, I don't know, 6 or more feet away from each other. So this actually cuts down on quite a bit of space. Obviously you still need the same cables, but you also are saving on batteries and whatever else you need when you have 2 separate units. So this is honestly, I mean, fantastic. And at the price, you're talking about, yeah, $1,000 for the system, which is the same as the Teradek Ace 500 or 750, which is what I normally recommend. But you can add an extra $300 and get 2 of them instead of the now $2,000 you'd have to be paying for that other system. So for a single camera, the price is maybe not amazing, but for 2, I mean, it's hard to beat. Let's take a look at the rest of the hardware, right? So I said that it supports 2 cameras, which is true, and each one of those can either be an HDMI or an SDI output. So you'll see HDMI and SDI on this side, and HDMI and SDI on this side. It also doesn't matter what's actually feeding into the transmitter, because if you look at this, you also have an HDMI in and an SDI in, and an SDI loop out, which is awesome if you're running in that workflow. But it doesn't matter what signal you feed in here, it will actually cross convert when it gets to the other side. So regardless of what your sources are, you can use whatever you need to. For example, in my church, our cameras are all HDMI, so we use the HDMI input, but our switcher is SDI. And so normally we would need some sort of adapter in that chain, but we don't need that anymore because we can run out of the SDI output here straight into our switcher, and it all works perfectly. This is another thing that I love to see on transmission units at this price point. Obviously, when you get into the higher price points, HDMI can maybe just go away altogether. But in this low to mid price range, it's kind of awesome to see both sides of it, because generally people aren't using HDMI switchers anymore. Most of them are going SDI, but a lot of us still have HDMI cameras. So that's a great little feature to see. All right, continuing to look at here, you've got a USB port. And on this, that can actually be used as a webcam output. So if your workflow requires you to plug this directly into a laptop for some reason, you totally can. That's not something we use, but it's good to know it's there. On the other side, you also have an Ethernet port. This will actually support NDI. So you can have your signals coming in and then use this as an NDI source into whatever your software is. Again, not something that fits for my workflow, but it's good to know that it's there. And then finally on this side, you have a power jack. It supports 6 to 16 volt DC. And look at this, also takes V-mount batteries. This is fantastic, especially on the receiver. It's gonna take a little bit more power, but it's great to see that. We use V-mounts in our workflow, so we have a couple of them kicking around. When you throw one of those on there, it clicks right in. And then, you know, it's a pretty beefy unit, but it's not crazy. Especially once you get this up on a stand and, you know, plug in your cables wherever you need to go to your monitor. I mean, this is a pretty compact unit considering that it can take up to 2 different inputs coming in. So we'll leave this here. Let's take a look at the transmitter. We already showed you the inputs here, the HDMI and the SDI, and then the SDI loop out. And then you also have a DC barrel jack. Both of these are threaded, by the way, so that's good to see, especially on something that might be getting moved around. However, on the back, it's not V-mount, but instead an MPF style battery, which makes sense for something like this. It's a little bit smaller. Other side, you also have that USB port. I think on this, it's actually just for updating the firmware. Next up here, we have an on-off switch, and actually the receiver has that as well on this side. And that's great to see. One of my biggest complaints about the Teradek units we have is that they just power on as soon as they're plugged in, which maybe doesn't matter that much, but it's kind of frustrating, especially when it comes to restarting them. You have to actually pull the power, and I don't know, I always feel weird doing that. So it's nice to see a physical button. I do wish it was a little harder to accidentally bump. I'm a little bit scared that this is going to happen while we're live someday, but hopefully not. We just need to place this in an area where it's not going to get accidentally triggered. And then finally on the transmitter, you have this little joystick and a tiny little screen, which actually brings me back to the receiver. Has a big screen and some big buttons. So we'll walk through the menus here in a little bit, but you can control some settings on both sides of this, which is great to see. Finally, these both also have detachable antennas. So you notice these things are pretty long, but they just unscrew and can get packed away really neatly whenever you're not using them. And then finally, both units have some nice quarter 20 threads on the bottom, and the receiver also has a larger one. And I never remember what that size is, but you know, if you know what that is, great. You can attach this to something a little bit bigger if you need to. So that's the hardware you get. It all feels pretty sturdy, like nothing's really crazy. I think the least sturdy part of this is probably the antenna themselves. They're a little top heavy, and I find that they kind of come unscrewed a little bit, so that's something you'll need to watch out for if you're using these on the go. But other than that, let's get these guys powered on and actually take a look at those menu systems and what you can do with them. We'll start with the receiver. Since I have it already on this V-mount battery, we flip that switch, and there it goes, starts to turn on. So it does take a little bit of time for it to actually get booted up and ready to go. And honestly, that's maybe a little bit reassuring that something is actually happening on the inside of this thing. But if we take a look at it, it will show the fan speed and then also your battery level, which is great if you're powering this on batteries, nice to see. And then your channel as well as your video signals. And so on this guy, you actually have the ability to change that channel either manually or just auto pairing. They come out of the box ready to go, which is awesome. I haven't actually had to change that at all. Everything has been working totally perfectly. So I find the menu system on the receiver pretty easy to navigate using these two buttons here and then your select button in the middle. So you have basic things like your pairing, your scanning, your fan mode. You also have something where it converts everything to 60p. I feel like if you're using this in a live setting, just leave this off. Then you have other settings, so streaming and web. And that's interesting because this can actually stream direct to an RTMP endpoint. So again, probably not super useful in the church broadcast realm, but if you needed to stream this to a remote location over RTMP or just directly to YouTube, if this was your only source, great. You can actually do that straight from this guy as long as it's connected to your network. And then you have system settings here. You can choose so that if you lose connection, you actually get a frozen frame or you get to see the logo depending on what works best for you. You can change the language and take a look at your firmware version. Nothing too exciting. Again, there's not actually a lot of settings to configure on this guy because it does a lot of the things manually. But the settings that are there are nice to see, give you a little bit of control over things that are sometimes annoying on other systems. Something else you may have noticed when we powered on are these two lights here that show the connection status between transmitters A and B. So that way you have just an easy look at whether or not your things are actually connected. And obviously, like we showed before, you also see those on the screen itself, right there. So let's take a look at the transmitter now. In this one, I'm going to actually plug in to the wall with my nice little cable. Same thing, we flip that switch. Now these do get kind of loud right when they turn on. You might have heard that fan, but they power down pretty quickly unless they actually need to be running. I haven't noticed any realistic fan noise from these in actual usage. So you can see here that these lights actually went ahead and turned green, and you can see I've got a connection on video A. But even though it shows that I've got a connection, it still says no video because this actually doesn't have any kind of source going into it. So again, you actually get a decent amount of information on that screen. And then similar with this screen, you get a handful of things if I can grab focus, your connection, your battery, and then just some information about the channels. Same thing though, we do have a menu that looks pretty similar as far as settings go. You have your pairing, your fan mode, and then your system, which gives you that same language and version info that you see before. So nothing super crazy that you need here. Everything kind of just works automatically out of the box. So software is pretty simple, but it gives you what you need. Now let's talk about actual performance, right? Because nobody's here thinking, oh, well, what does the on-screen menu give me? Because it's never gonna be that interesting. What you care about is, do these actually work? Now I forgot to say this earlier, but Hollyland did send me these units for free to test out, and I do get to keep them, but they don't get any say in what I'm talking about here, and they're not gonna see this video before any of you. unless, they just happen to watch it before you guys. All these opinions are my own and my own testing. And I'm happy to say, yes, they actually work pretty dang well. So let's talk about latency first, because I know all of us care about that when we're working on live productions. I'm not even gonna tell you what they actually quote for any of these things, because in my opinion, it doesn't really matter what their marketing materials say. All that really matters is real world usage. So as far as latency goes, here's how I measured it, which is usually how I measure latency on any wireless system. Keep that in mind. Basically, I had a feed coming out of my camera into an HDMI splitter, and that sent 3 different signals. One was just straight to my switcher through a cable. The next one went through our existing wireless system, the Teradek Ace 500, into our switcher. And the third one went through the Cosmo C2 into our switcher. So this way I could compare it against a hardwire and against our existing wireless system. Now, I know that there will be some added latency because of the splitter, but because everything is still coming from that same source, everything should be fair across the board when I'm comparing it. I'm not recording in camera or running anything direct from the camera to the switcher. So how did this compare? Well, when we look at the results, like normal, my Teradek is actually showing pretty much 0 latency. It's pretty much spot on with our hardwire connection. And the Cosmo C2 is not quite as good, but I'm generally only seeing about 1 frame of latency. So it is still worse than the Teradek, but 1 frame, I think I can make do with most of the time in our live broadcasts. Most people are not going to pick up on that in my experience. Now, obviously, if you're looking for it, you definitely can, but that's where it's at. And these findings were consistent when we actually used them on a Sunday morning, and I'll show you some footage from that in a little bit. Next, how about range? Again, they quote some absurd number for range, I'm sure. And the reality is, I didn't have any problems. We set it up in our auditorium and didn't have any problems there. I also did a test in our building where I set it up in one room and then went downstairs through some cinder block walls, and I didn't have any dropouts or anything like that. They have some sort of fancy auto channel switching, something or other mumbo jumbo. Again, it doesn't really matter what it is that it's doing as long as it works in the real world, and I was noticing it works in the real world. I actually found that compared to my Teradek, they actually had slightly better range. At least they connected faster at those long ranges. And they worked in back hallways that my Teradek always disconnects in. So your mileage may vary, and I always recommend putting these as close to the transmitters as you can, but you might be able to eke out a little bit more range with these. I have been, at least. And speaking about that range, let's talk about the connection for a second. I did some timings just out of curiosity, and maybe you'll care about this too. When you power on both units at the same time, it takes about 20 seconds until they're fully connected and there's an image available on the other side. And that's starting from scratch. So that's definitely not bad. If your receiver is already on and you power on your transmitter, I clocked that at about 17 seconds. So just a little bit faster in that scenario. But the one I'm most interested in, and would probably actually be an issue, is what if you lose your video signal on your transmitter and it's still transmitting? Well, after I unplugged and replugged in my video signal, it was about 7 seconds until that video signal was regained on the receiver side. Take that how you will. To me, 7 seconds is totally fine, but it's nice to kind of have those numbers in your back pocket in case you're seeing anything different. All right, now image quality. This one's always a little bit tricky, right? Because you're sending signal over the air. And this is somewhere where Hollyland has struggled, in my opinion, in the past. Anytime I've tried some of their wireless video units, I just feel like the quality has not been there. I've seen a decent amount of smearing and blockiness in the image, and the quality just did not line up with what I was seeing from my other units. However, this one honestly is just quite a bit different. When I compare it side by side with the wired unit, it looks a little different. I feel like if you're really pixel peeping, you can definitely tell. And when you compare with the Teradek, I would say the Teradek almost looks artificially sharpened, in my opinion, which has never really been an issue for me, but I do notice it. However, it's a little bit softer of an image. And that might come down to preference, honestly. I don't think I have a problem with it, especially with our fast-moving cameras on stage. I actually think it looks pretty pleasing and helps kind of cut down on some noticeable out-of-focus shots. I think they're sometimes a little more obvious on the Teradek system, and this kind of helps our camera operators a little bit. So testing in the real world, we actually set both of these up on our wireless handheld cameras on stage, where we normally have our Teradek units. And I would say overall, the ease of use of them was so much better than the Teradeks. I didn't have to put the receiver quite as close. I didn't have to have 2 separate receivers spread apart, and everything just connected. Sometimes with our Teradeks, we actually have to power cycle them. They'll work perfectly during rehearsal, but then by the time we get to the service, I have to power cycle the receivers because one of them just won't connect for some reason. It's always a little bit annoying and honestly a little bit scary because we're doing that right before service, and I just feel like, are they gonna come back on time? And I never really know. With these, both times they just connected, again, in 20 seconds and no issues whatsoever. I didn't have any dropouts, I didn't have any problems there. And the receiver was actually in the back of the room rather than on stage where I normally put the Teradek receivers. So that was really cool to see that even with people in the room, I was still getting that same range that I was seeing before. If we look at the footage, you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about. One, about the image looking maybe a little bit softer than the wired counterparts. And you can still see that one frame of latency that I was talking about.
My song of praise, holy, holy, holy,
Overall, I was very happy with what was happening, especially considering this was in the back of the room and considering the extra ease of setup and the cost savings. Again, the receiver with 2 transmitters comes out to $1,300 US compared to $2,000 for 2 Teradek ACE units. So even though this is very different than what I've said in the past, I'm actually recommending this Hollyland Cosmo C2 to people to use. I think it checks all the boxes or gets close enough that honestly, I think it's totally usable in most church settings. If you are the most nitpicky of all nitpicky, you will notice that frame of latency. But when we're talking about ease of use and budget, that one frame may be totally worth it in your situation. Now, if you're doing iMag in the room, that may become a different issue if you've already got some latency for that. Your mileage may vary, and again, everyone's situation is a little bit different, so test it out maybe and see how it works for you before you commit to totally buying it and replacing all of your other wireless systems. I think my biggest complaint, honestly, is the antenna are kind of annoying and are a little bit loose. The old Teradek units are actually just kind of boxes without big antennas on them, so we were able to kind of tuck them to the side a little bit more, whereas these definitely get in the way on our wireless cameras a bit more. So that just comes down to rigging, and we just have to rig them a little bit differently in the future than what we've been doing currently, but that's kind of a non-issue. Honestly, I think these are great. I think Hollyland has come a long way since the other units I've tested from them, and I think that they're a serious contender now. Again, like I said, they don't have the zero latency that the Teradek units are offering, so if that's super important to you, these still aren't the ones for you. But if you have a little bit of wiggle room there, I would really recommend these. Look, tech is getting more affordable and better at those affordable levels, so I don't think that everyone needs to be going out and spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on their wireless systems anymore. Now, maybe these will break in 6 months. I mean, who knows? I don't have a long durability test here, but at the price, I kind of feel like they're worth trying out if you really need wireless video. And again, with the range and the double outputs on a receiver, I mean, these things are pretty great, and I've really enjoyed testing them, and we're definitely going to keep using them. So if they're for you, go ahead and check out the link in the description and you can buy them there. I'll get a small kickback from that and it won't cost you anything extra. If you've used these at your church, let me know down in the comments and let me know how you're liking them. I love to hear other people's opinions and thoughts on these things, just so that I'm not the only one. But anyway, these are great. We're gonna use them. Until next time.